everyone, and welcome. I'm Nancy Gibbs. I'm the director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy here at the Kennedy School. And today we get to explore the gifts and tools and techniques that the very best journalists deploy when they are pursuing the very hardest stories. We've invited the 6 finalists of the 2023 Goldsmith Prize in Investigative Reporting, which was first awarded in 1993 and funded by a gift from the Greenfield Foundation. This prize honors public service investigative journalism that has made an impact on local or state or federal public policy or the practice of politics. Every year, as we manage the impossible task of narrowing down thousands of pages of great journalism down to 6 finalists, I'm inspired by just the grit and tenacity and creativity of reporters from newsrooms large and small. So I'm eager to learn from them what it took to produce the groundbreaking work that led to their selection as finalists. I'm going to invite each of them to tell you a little bit about the story of their stories and learn more about what went into this kind of reporting, and then we'll have a chance at the end to take your questions. So as we go, please feel free to drop questions into the chat, and as we have time at the end, we will share them with our panelists. First, we have Mike Balsamo, who's the U.S. law enforcement news editor for the Associated Press. Along with Mike Sisak, he investigated dysfunction and abuse in the U.S. federal prison system, which led to congressional hearings and leadership changes at the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Miranda Green is director of investigations at Floodlight. She and her colleagues, Mario Ariza at Floodlight and David Folkenflik at NPR, uncovered a media manipulation campaign being waged by power companies in the South to confront their political opponents, which led to leadership changes and internal investigations at the power companies, along with broad calls for transparency and reform. Barbara Laker is an investigative reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, where she and her colleagues, David Gambacorta and William Bender, found widespread fraud in use of the Philadelphia Police Force's Disability Benefits Program. Their reporting led to audits, internal investigations, and proposed new legislation, as well as a 31% increase in a decrease in officers out with injury claims by the end of the year. Micah Rosenberg is national immigration reporter at Reuters. She and her colleagues, Joshua Schneier and Christina Cook, discovered that undocumented immigrant children were being hired illegally through employment agencies to work in dangerous poultry processing plants and factories producing car parts for major auto companies. After their reporting, numerous children were released from their contracts, and investigations and discussions with the Department of Labor are underway. Brian Rosenthal is an investigative reporter on the Metro desk of the New York Times, where he and Eliza Shapiro did deep reporting to reveal the extent to which Hasidic-run schools in New York State were failing to provide basic education to their students, while also regularly relying on corporal punishment, and all while receiving more than $1 billion in public funding over just 4 years. Multiple investigations followed, and state lawmakers introduced legislation to ban corporal punishment in private schools. And finally, Anna Wolf is an investigative reporter writing about poverty and economic justice for Mississippi Today. Over the span of several years, she uncovered a deep web of corruption and embezzlement in the state that denied poor families the welfare assistance that they deserved and funneled the money into pet projects for elected officials and their friends. Her reporting led to multiple criminal investigations, state and federal hearings, and legislation to reform the state welfare system. So as you can tell, we have a really interesting mix of topics that these reporters have been working on, with implications for private companies, for public agencies, for elected officials, for regulators. And so for future policymakers and public leaders, and for future journalists, there's so much to learn from how they went about covering and uncovering the information that informed these stories. So Mike, I want to start with you, and I'd ask that you give us both the origin story of where this project came from, how it arose, and how you pursued it, the main obstacles that you ran into in doing the reporting, any surprises that you encountered, and then finally, did it make a difference? What was the impact that you saw that it had?
Sure. Thanks, Nancy. And before I start, I just want to say I'm really honored to be part of this panel with 5 other really incredible journalists. This is, it really just speaks to the impact that journalism has made over the last year. So my colleague Mike Sisak and I began investigating the Federal Bureau of Prisons in 2019 after the death of Jeffrey Epstein at a federal jail in New York City. And we set out to answer, how was it possible that arguably the nation's most high-profile inmate would be able to kill himself while in custody? And what we found was systemic problems within this agency, one of the largest agencies in the federal government, the largest Justice Department agency, both by size. And so as we started to investigate, we found that the problems that we were seeing that contributed to Jeffrey Epstein's death at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York City, staffing problems, issues with cameras, issues with overtime, contraband issues, right, were happening at prisons across the country. And as we continued to dig, we just found that it was more and more systemic. And so we spelled out in a series of kind of smaller stories each of these issues, staffing issues that had officers, working countless hours of overtime, resulting in serious safety concerns, right, resulting in real life impact of inmate suicides where officers could not respond to emergencies. We reported on dozens of escapes that were happening, and correction officers from across the country who themselves were accused of serious misconduct or arrested for misconduct. More than 100 correctional officers who were arrested for misconduct. The largest number of Justice Department employees compared to any other agency, the FBI, the US Marshal Service, DEA, ATF, all the kind of the names that you would know at home. And so as we continued to do that reporting, lawmakers started to take notice, and the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, reading our story about prison officials being arrested, sentenced, or convicted or sentenced for serious crimes, demanded that the Attorney General fire the then director of the Bureau of Prisons, Michael Carbajal. It was about a month later that my colleague Mike Sisak and I were sitting in a Starbucks in New York, strategizing about what would kind of be the next story, when Mike got a call from a source who we had been talking to, who told us that, in fact, the director had then issued his resignation to the Attorney General. And so we broke that story in that Starbucks and continued reporting. The Justice Department did not immediately replace Michael Carbajal as the director of the Bureau of Prisons. So despite his resignation, he remained in charge of this agency, a massive agency, in charge of 150,000 inmates and with a budget of more than $8 billion. And so we continued to investigate, and what we found was one prison in particular in California where there were really systemic allegations of sexual misconduct involving female inmates. And those allegations involved line employees, so correctional officers, all the way up to the warden of that jail, who was accused of sexually assaulting inmates in his care, taking photos of them and keeping those photos on his government cell phone. And in this reporting, we exposed how over and over these inmates had come forward. They tried to report their abuse. Other workers there also tried to report that there was this systemic abuse, and that the allegations against these mostly male staff members were ignored or set aside. Prisoners were sent to solitary confinement for reporting abuse, and the officials in charge of preventing or investigating that sexual misconduct, like the warden, were themselves accused of abusing inmates or neglecting their concerns. In one situation there, for example, a female inmate said a man who was her work supervisor had taunted her by saying, let the games begin, when he assigned her to work with a man who she had accused of raping her. In another situation, another worker claimed he wanted to get inmates pregnant. And of course, the warden, as I said, kept nude photographs of inmates he was accused of abusing on his government issued cell phone, and was later, charged and convicted in federal court. And so we continue to report all of this. The Justice Department launched a task force specifically to look at the allegations at that federal prison in Dublin, California. We knew that when that task force was launched, which included the then director, that we wanted to be there when that happened. When the task force was there, the Bureau of Prisons and the Justice Department didn't want us to be there. And so we went anyway. We told the Bureau of Prisons we were going to be there, and if the director wants to talk to us, great. And if not, we were going to figure out what happened during these task force meetings, and we were going to report about it. And that's exactly what we did. And we put faces to names of sources who we've been talking to for a very long time. And in that reporting, we learned about the interim warden who had been put in charge of the same prison. That interim warden would later be promoted to be in charge of all prisons in the western part of the United States. That's, a massive number of federal inmates we're talking about who he was in charge of. And in all of these conversations that we were having with sources in different parts of California, we drove for hours up to kind of the tip of Northern California down to San Diego. And we were talking to all of these people who we had met in the course of our reporting. And everyone was telling us the same story about this guy, the interim warden, and how, in these training sessions, he would boast about how in the 1990s, he was a part of a violent racist group of correctional officers known as the Cowboys, and that he got away with beating Black inmates. And so it was intriguing in the sense that we had heard this story from so many different people, all telling us this very, very similar story of him recounting this same story to all of these people. And so we started to really dig in on this one particular employee. At the same time, we learned that members of Congress started to visit the prison in Dublin after our reporting. And that, again, the same character, Thomas Ray Hinkle, came up as the acting warden, and he was stonewalling members of Congress, including Representative Jackie Speer, who was leading a delegation from the House Oversight Committee there. And that he was blocking whistleblowers. And so we started to dig in on Mr. Hinkle, and what we uncovered was, thousands of pages of court records and other documents from the National Archives that backed up these allegations, where he was accused of being part of a violent racist group known as the Cowboys, he himself being implicated in several of these incidents. And despite that, and despite the Bureau of Prisons knowing about this for so long, he was promoted 9 more times, most recently to acting regional director of that entire region. The Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations launched their own series of hearings for the chairman, Senator John Ossoff, then issued a subpoena, a very rare subpoena from a Democrat to a Democratic administration to compel the then director of the Bureau of Prisons, Michael Carvajal, despite the fact that he had resigned, to appear before his committee when Carvajal and the Justice Department had refused to do so. He did appear under that subpoena and was questioned extensively about our reporting in Dublin. Senator Ossoff also introduced several other pieces of legislation, including a bill that required the Bureau of Prisons to install cameras at its prisons, an issue that we had highlighted significantly in our reporting, which was later signed into law by the president. The Justice Department changed the way that it processes complaints from inmates across the country, and now requires federal prosecutors to prioritize allegations that are made by specifically female inmates, and that U.S. attorneys across the country need to bring these cases as a top priority. That was a directive straight from the Attorney General. And the chairman, obviously, of the Senate Judiciary Committee has continued to hold hearings, to hold accountable the new director of the Bureau of Prisons to kind of make this change. And to answer, I think, one final question that you had there, kind of the most surprising thing that we uncovered in this reporting, I think, was despite the fact that this was a massive federal agency. There was very little oversight of it for years and years. Even members of Congress admitted to us that they had kind of dropped the ball in not doing their due diligence and making sure that they held this agency accountable.
It's a classic case of journalists playing that crucial accountability role. Thank you, Mike, so much. So Miranda, tell us the story of how a power company can run a media manipulation campaign.
Yeah, sure. I feel like all of these are going to be really hard to follow. So thank you, Mike, for sharing your story. That was incredible reporting. Yeah, I think the easiest way to describe our story and how we came across this is to talk about how Floodlight works. The company I work for is a collaborative in nature. So we co-publish all of our pieces with other local and national publications. And my colleague, Mario Ariza, is based in Miami and had previously been working with the Sentinel in Miami and knew that they had been doing some incredible work about ghost candidate scandals. Essentially, there were local elections happening and there were people whose names were being put on the ballots that seemed eerily similar to other candidates who were running and were effectively pulling votes away from candidates and keeping them from winning. Most of them a Democratic ticket, so Republican candidates were getting higher number of votes. So we knew that this information had been kind of reported on a local level, kind of bit by bit over the course of a year through a document dump that the Orlando Sentinel had gotten. And so we reached out to them and asked if they were planning on doing any more information with it. And we wanted to see if they would want to partner with us. Originally, we approached the story thinking it was going to be a way to elevate it and kind of rewrite it from a national perspective. How does this happen? What does this mean? And kind of repackage it in a way that readers who are outside of Florida, and maybe even readers in Florida who weren't following along on a daily basis, could realize to the full extent of what was actually happening. It's kind of this crazy, insane thing that is technically legal that was happening that included the funneling of money. And I'll say technically legal because it's actually currently under DOJ investigation. As we started diving into that, we actually started getting more document leaks, more unannounced documents. We ended up with 1,200 pages were sent to us both digitally and physically. And that was kind of the crux of what ended up being the main part of our story and kind of the main the main issue and obstacle that we faced, which was determining what we had at our fingertips and also verifying it, making sure that it was accurate. We spent the majority of a year looking through these documents and trying to figure out what was actually what they meant, what they were saying. A lot of them were payments, a lot of them were acronyms, and kind of we started with the very basics of trying to figure out the timeline, seeing if they overlapped with things that we could verify, calling people who were mentioned in them, trying to figure out who they were. And as we did more reporting and did more interviews, more things became more aware to us. We became more clear what we were looking at. That partnership published, and as we were kind of, trying to figure out what the next steps were, we still had so much information we hadn't covered. David Folkenflik at NPR, was interested in what we were covering and reached out to us and said he was interested in looking at potentially a media angle there. And what he didn't know is that we had 600 pages of documents just about media payments that we hadn't even touched. So it was kind of a prime opportunity. We decided to collaborate together, work together, and we spent the next 5 months sifting through these documents, looking at how Matrix LLC, which is a big company based in Alabama, but does a lot of work in Florida as well, basically on behalf of its power company clients, mostly Alabama Power and Florida Power and Light, was using front groups, dark money groups, to funnel money to pay at least 6 different publications across Florida and Alabama. And what those publications were doing to a varying extent were essentially working as an echo chamber to kind of attack people that were questioning what was happening at the 2 utilities. Either they were challenging them in terms of how much they were charging ratepayers for their power bills, or they were individuals that were actually running for office that had stances that would have, definitely put a dent in the bottom line of these power companies. And so we were able to kind of do a deep dive into the kind of tone of their information, the way that they covered Alabama Power and Florida Power and Light, and really look at it from a perspective of media manipulation. And what's so interesting and compelling about what we found is that this was happening at a time when the trust in mainstream media was at an all-time low. People, especially in red states like Alabama and, a very reddish purple state like Florida, were looking to find news outside of places like CNN, where I used to work. And we're looking for alternative ways to find information. And then they were also, facing a news desert. A lot of local news publications really were drying up. There was, at the time when we were writing the story, not a single daily newspaper publishing in Alabama when we wrote this. And so it was kind of prime opportunity for these essentially front newspapers to set themselves up and create these echo chambers of information, in which many cases actually did, in at least one instance, successfully keep someone from winning re-election and from challenging Alabama Power in terms of opening up their books and figuring out why customers were paying as much as they were. In the course of our story, we also found some kind of incredible information, especially from a journalist perspective. Matrix actually had on its books a freelance reporter who was an active freelance reporter for ABC News National, working for Good Morning America, who was in her spare time also interviewing people that Alabama Power and Florida Power and Light had a vested interest in keeping from winning elections. We talked to those individuals, and they said she had approached them and said she was working for ABC News. ABC News told us that she was never working on stories for them in that capacity. The questions she asked really took those politicians by surprise. They seemed very pointed. They seemed very challenging. In one case, she even showed up at a congressman's house and demanded that his wife let her in so she could look for him when he was actually in DC at the time. And basically the outcome of these stories when they published is, first and foremost, when the ABC story aired, which was our second piece, ABC cut all ties with the reporter, so they would not work with her anymore. And then we actually had quite a list of shakeups at the utility companies. During the course of the investigation, the CEO of Alabama Power stepped down without a successor in place, which was highly questionable. We later learned that the utility had actually commissioned an investigation into its relationship with Matrix while we were doing our reporting and asking questions of them as we were going along. And then this January, Southern Company, which is the parent company of Alabama Power, also announced senior leadership changes, including the departure of the CEO, Tom Fanning, who was a key figure in one of our stories, and we believe was also the subject of being spied on by Matrix. And later that month, Florida Power and Light CEO Eric Szilagyi suddenly also stepped down. He was interviewed and cited heavily in our reporting, and they announced the change came after FPL had actually called for 2 internal investigations looking into Matrix. And during an interview with shareholders, a spokesperson for the company told investors that the media allegations had taken a toll on him.
Wow. Very different kind of story. And yet again, just it takes such kind of ingenuity to pull all of those pieces together. Barbara, tell us about the racket in the Philadelphia police force with the doctors and the disability.
Well, first, I'm so grateful to be among such talented journalists. So thank you. Well, this series started with a call from a cop, actually, who was a source who said that there was this huge problem in the Philadelphia Police Department and that they had hundreds of police officers who were claiming to be injured. Over 600 of them. It turned out to be 1 in 7 cops that were out. The reason why this was so drastic in Philadelphia is because it really affected the manpower. In Philadelphia right now, we're in like an epidemic of gun violence. And so obviously we didn't have names. We did we filed a right to know to get the list, because every week they publish a list or have a list of every officer who's out injured on duty. That at first obviously got denied because they said that we were asking for medical information. We asked for it redacted and it was still denied. So we eventually went to the Pennsylvania Office of Open Records. They allowed us to have the redacted information, but that still didn't help us with the names. So my colleagues, Bill, David, and I have lots of police sources. So we call every single police source we have, and we collect basically a list of all these cops who were injured, some of them for months, some of them for years. We knew we couldn't prove that they were not injured, even though the majority of them said the doctor had signed off and said they were so injured they couldn't even show up for court.
And
So-
injured, we're saying not like on the job, shot in the line of duty injured.
Oh,
right?
no. They said some of them said they had a injured shoulder. One had an injured finger. It was all over the place, the different injuries. Some cops said they had fallen off an office chair. I mean, it got that crazy. So we eventually compiled a list, but we couldn't prove that they were injured or not injured. But we knew that we'd heard some of them were working another job while they were doing this. And when they were out injured, they were actually getting a raise because they didn't have to pay state and federal taxes. So some of them, we found a roofer, we found a cop who was actually, the whole time he was injured, he was playing on a semi-pro softball league, traveling all around. He was even MVP. We found another cop who became he started a whole motivational speaking business. And so, but we had to prove they were actually doing the job because that's against police directive. So with the roofer, for example, there was a truck in his driveway. I went up to him and he said, "Oh no, that's not my truck. And my wife, that's her business." So we first sat outside his house for a long time thinking we could catch him going to a roofing job, but we couldn't. But he had a roofing website, his business website, and he made the mistake of putting pictures of houses that he'd done the roof on. We didn't have the address, but a colleague at work was able to do a reverse lookup, and we got the address. We called the owners of these houses and they said, "Oh yeah, Alfie did my roof." So, and then there were two brothers that worked in a linen business. We sat outside that for a long time and saw them lifting heavy bags and so forth. And so we were able to get a lot of cops examples of this where they were working another job while they were supposedly injured. And that really helped the story. Then we turned to the police union in Philadelphia is allowed to select the doctors that these cops go to sign off. And what really amazed us is over the years, there were 7 doctors. 5 of them we found had real questionable histories. I mean, one of them was accused by at least 2 patients of sexually abusing them and drugging them, making them like they were heroin addicts and opioid addicts. 5 of the 7 actually had a cash diet pill business where people would go in and buy pills, loose pills, and pay cash. One of the, in fact, a mom of one of the cops died after being addicted to these diet pills. Another of the doctors was arrested for a DUI. And when she got arrested for DUI, she told the arresting cop that she said, "You don't know who I am? I'm a Philadelphia police officer." So there were a lot of surprises in this, and the police officers, some of them denied being who they were. One of them, the 2 in the linen business, his name was Ryan Nuss. And then I asked for him and he said, "Oh, I'm just a Ryan." And then his brother James walked in and he said, "Oh, I'm not James." And so that got sticky because we had to prove that they were actually lying and that they were really like James and Ryan, which we were able to do. What else? There were so many surprises in this. We were surprised how many cops were out and the number of years that they were out, that the kind of injuries that they had. We got a picture of one of the cops who had stitches on her finger, and she'd been out for years and said the doctor signed off and said she couldn't show up for court. We got a lot of reaction from the story, and we did see some results. By the end of the year, the number of cops out injured on duty dropped by 31%. The city controller conducted an audit of the whole system and found that it clearly, as you could tell, wasn't working. The police commissioner was outraged, and she ordered an internal investigation within the police department. Two of the police officers, the two brothers in the linen business, they actually left the police department before the story before the first story ran. And then there was legislation introduced that would change the entire system in essence, because the police union would no longer be allowed to, or given the power to pick the doctors, that they would be independently picked. And the city council held a hearing, and the doctors that were still remaining after we were doing more and more stories, some of the doctors they resigned from being what they call a heart and lung doctor. And so by the end of the year, the city was left with only one of the doctors that the FOP had picked.
I do wonder about a police commissioner who 1 out of 7 officers is not coming to work, who is shocked and outraged to discover that 1 out of 7 officers is not coming to work. But what an amazing,
Good point, Nancy. That's a good point.
amazing story. Micah, the reporting on undocumented people, especially children, is so hard, where you have to protect, privacy and safety and everything. Tell us the story of how you got your extraordinary story.
Yeah, well, we actually started reporting on this in mid-2021, and my colleague Christina Cook got a tip from a longtime source sort of saying, have you ever heard of this place, Enterprise, Alabama? We've seen that there's a huge number of a growing number of unaccompanied minors who have crossed the border alone, were taken into federal custody, and then released into this very small rural area. And inside the government, there were red flags being raised that there could be instances of labor trafficking, human trafficking there. Or labor exploitation there. And so we really started to dig into this, and we first turned to data on releases of unaccompanied kids, and saw that indeed in that county there had been a big jump where there hadn't been releases before. And so started finding out more about the community there, and found out that there were a lot of chicken processing plants, and then there were concerns that there were migrants who were working in dangerous conditions there, and potentially minors. And so we ended up going to the area and finding young teens who had ended up in chicken processing plants in very dangerous jobs, cleaning shift around very dangerous machines. And so published that first story. And then from that, we got another more explosive tip that there were actually even younger kids potentially working in car part manufacturing plants. And so we ended up learning that there had been actually a young girl who police thought was 12 at the time, but we learned that she was 13, who had been briefly sort of kidnapped or gone missing with one of her adult coworkers and taken across across the state line. And so through that case, we discovered that she was among a cohort of children who were working very long shifts in these 12-hour a day shifts overnight during the day, building these car parts. And then we started digging into what were the companies that were that these cars were being supplied to, and we found out that the company that she was working at was actually a majority owned subsidiary of Hyundai, one of the third largest car producer in the United States, making very popular cars and SUVs sold all over the country. And so when we published that first story, There, there was a lot of reaction from that. And local Alabama investigators started investigating. This was in Enterprise, Alabama. And then federal investigators started looking into it, and we continued our reporting. And over the course of the next few months, we discovered that in the whole car parts supply chain that supplied to the main Hyundai manufacturer in Montgomery, we found at least 10 of these plants were using underage laborers, kids mostly from Central America, mostly from Guatemala, many of whom had recently crossed the border, some with their families, some who had arrived alone and then were released later, were ending up working. And usually they were being hired through these sort of third-party staffing firms, who did a kind of minimal amount of vetting to see if they, to verify whether or not they were of legal age to work. Some of them, we discovered through talking to many former workers, current workers who had worked alongside them, including some of the children themselves, said that they had IDs that said that they were, in their 30s, that were clearly, kids that were 12 and 13, just by the look of their faces, shouldn't have been on the factory floor. And these are, plants, obviously, with very dangerous machines. We documented, injuries that had happened in the plants, even deaths, amputations, and these kids, weren't going to school. And so, immediately after our reporting, we learned that some of the parts suppliers were firing workers. And then, after we published our first story, there was federal investigators went into a different Hyundai supplier and actually found kids on the factory floor and took them into federal custody. And we later discovered that among them, there was a pair of brothers, 13 and 15, who were living by themselves, but living without their parents and with other adult workers in a house that was owned by one of the labor recruiters. And so those kids were rescued from the plant and taken back into federal custody. And, since then, at first when we first published our story, Hyundai at first said that there wasn't, evidence of this. And then later, once the subsequent raid happened and once our reporting came out saying that there was as many as 10 Hyundai suppliers that could be, were being scrutinized for child labor violations, there was a series of actions that Hyundai said that it would take. They ultimately have said that they were going to divest their interest in the original company that we wrote about. And they have also taken a, series of actions to try and, increase oversight at all of their suppliers and to ensure that, children are not hired in the future. But the investigations are ongoing. The Department of Labor is still investigating. Other federal and state agencies are also investigating. So it's an ongoing process. And, just obviously, as you said at the beginning, Nancy, reporting on these issues is always very difficult and very sensitive. And we took a lot of, care and in figuring out how we were going to, identify and when to identify, certain people in the story. There was some former workers who ended up going on the record, but it took months and months and months of convincing them because of the risks of for their own job, sometimes for their own immigration status, and we chose not to identify the minors by name, even though we had spoken to some of them in person.
Brian, I suspect you faced actually some similar although different challenges than Micah, because reporting on the Hasidic community and reporting especially on children and the impact of education policies on those children. Talk about a group that is very hard to get them to talk. So tell us how that story came together.
Yeah, sure. Our reporting started in 2019 when New York City put out a report that said that they had received a complaint about the quality of education in Hasidic Jewish schools. And they had done an initial investigation and found that a number of these schools were not providing an adequate education. But that report was very flimsy. It was only a few pages. It didn't name the schools. It didn't say why they were not providing an adequate education, in what ways they were failing. It didn't say how many kids were attending, and it didn't say what the city was going to do about it. And ultimately, the city didn't do anything about it. And so my colleague Eliza Shapiro and I looked at each other and decided that we were going to look into this ourselves and find out what we could. And the reporting was difficult. The Hasidic community is very insular. They very intentionally do not communicate with the outside world. And it's actually really unacceptable for people in that community to talk to outsiders and to openly criticize leaders. And so, people could be excommunicated just for talking to us. And so we had to be very careful. We slowly built sources kind of on the edges and got people to introduce us to other people and introduce us to even more people. And eventually we end up interviewing more than 275 people for the story. We also filed dozens and dozens of FOIA requests, really seeking information about anything we could find out. There was no, before we did our project, there was no listing of how many Hasidic schools there are in New York, or how many kids they had. And so we had to really piece things together with a lot of different records from different agencies. Looking at the funding took many months and many FOIAs. And we were ultimately able to obtain some test scores as well. And what we ultimately found was that it's a huge community, the Hasidic community in New York. In the all boys schools in particular, there are 50,000 students. They receive more than $350 million every year. And they post some of the lowest test scores of any schools in the state. In fact, the lowest.
100% failure rate.
Yeah, I mean, in the largest Hasidic school, 2,000 students, not a single one passed the test. So, and that kind of leads into what was really surprising about the story for us was that, I had been an education reporter previously. Eliza is an education reporter now. We had heard about schools that have struggled and schools that have low test scores. But what was really different about these schools is that they were in many ways intentionally failing. In many cases, they did not want to provide secular education. They thought that it was a threat to their way of life. And so it was really how blatant they were that was really shocking for us. Tracing the impact on the students and how students would not receive an education and then grow up and be unable to find a job and live in poverty. It was very sensitive and meaningful reporting for us. Thankfully, there's been a good amount of impact since the story came out. You mentioned the legislation on corporal punishment that has been introduced, which has been really picking up steam in the legislature. There have been other proposals in the legislature. The State Education Commission also passed new rules for private schools and academic standards. And the State Education Commission also has been doing investigations into schools and found that for the first time that a school was not complying with the law because they were not providing an adequate education. There have been 2 legal cases that have come out, both of which, well, I'm sorry, one of which was underway before our story. And in that one, the school admitted to a years-long financial fraud. And the other one that was just filed recently was specifically about special education in the Hasidic community, which is another topic that we looked at finding that in this community, they receive a lot of special ed money, but the services are not always needed or even provided sometimes. And so there's a criminal case that was filed, and the City Department of Education also announced that it was going to stop doing business with 20 different special ed companies in this community. So yeah, there's been a lot of impact from the reporting.
Really, really extraordinary. And Anna, I feel like, many people found out about the stories you were uncovering once Brett Favre's name came into the headlines, but you had been on this story for a long time by that point.
Yeah, my reporting on this story really began in 2017. A statistic came out in a report showing that the state was only approving 1.5% of people who were applying for cash welfare assistance. And that number really kind of tipped me off to something larger happening. And that's when I kind of in earnest started requesting records from the Department of Human Services. I think my tally is up to around 90 public records requests that I've issued to the Department of Human Services, which administers the state's welfare program, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, the federal program. And as a lot of people know, as you guys probably know in your own states, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, born out of welfare reform in the 90s, gives states just such there's such lax requirements around how this money can be spent. And the states are really, given a lot of discretion to spend the money however they wish. So I knew that if the money wasn't going directly to very poor families through direct cash assistance, like where was the rest of the money going, right? Like show me the proof of what we're doing with these funds, who's being helped, who's getting jobs, how are we putting a dent in our poverty rate in the poorest state in the country, right? And as far as challenges go, not getting records back that showed anything. So the federal government requires very little detail in terms of how these dollars are spent in federal reports every year. And so they were just passing off the same thing that they gave to the feds, which didn't have any details in terms of receipts and expenditures and actual purchases. So I filed a complaint against the department in 2018. I was still actually at the statewide newspaper at the time. So when I got hired at Mississippi Today, which is where I work now, a nonprofit, kind of brought all that baggage with me, brought the complaint over with me, and told my editor that this was the first thing that I wanted to figure out on this new job, which I pitched to him a poverty beat. Essentially, there had not been a poverty beat in the state prior to that. So starting in late 2018, just really starting to kind of grill the agency on where these funds are going, and realize that tens of millions of these federal dollars every year were going to nonprofits where they had kind of consolidated all TANF grants. And then they would get the decision to dole the money out how they wanted, the private nonprofit would. And to me, this was privatization of welfare is what I was calling it. At that time, I also got the auditor involved. I told him, I think that DHS might be an interesting subject for an audit at some point. And starting in 2019, writing stories about how secretive the agency was being about welfare funds. There was one employee that I had interviewed at the department. He was a pretty high level employee, and he was the one that I was really grilling at the time. And he was kind of the one who would, actually return my call and kind of level with me. Behind the scenes, I didn't know this, but he was gathering information about suspected fraud against his boss, the director of the agency, which he then took to the governor, who took that information to the auditor. And that's when the auditor's investigation began into actual theft of these dollars, actual fraud. Fast forward to 2020, and arrests are made in the case. 6 people are arrested for stealing $4 million of TANF funds. And one of the companies named in the indictments was a pharmaceutical company called Prevacus. But that's basically all that we got. We just knew that these 6 people had been, running this scam and were now facing these charges. And I pretty quickly learned that this company that had received stolen welfare funds was a company that had been promoted by and was being sponsored by former NFL quarterback Brett Favre. So I, went back to the agency, requested any emails related to Brett Favre, and found that the governor and Brett Favre had actually requested that the Department of Human Services director meet with them to discuss these 2 projects, the pharmaceutical company and a facility at USM. Shortly after that, I was able to piece together that $5 million in welfare money actually went to build a volleyball stadium at the University of Southern Mississippi, which is Brett Favre's alma mater. At that point, everyone wanted to know what the governor's role was. The governor in Mississippi has broad oversight of the Department of Human Services, basically unilateral power in terms of how that agency is run. There's no board. It's an agency under the governor's office, but no one wanted to say what the governor's role was. The state auditor, who was actually appointed by the governor originally, did not include Bryant in any of his reports, or when he would talk about the case, he kind of omitted the governor's involvement altogether. He even called the governor the whistleblower in the case, sort of trying to paint him as the hero here. So, after that, the story had kind of died because no one could get any information about Phil Bryant's involvement. I remember I actually went to the nonprofit founder who was charged with, crimes related to this, had a yard sale in late 2020, the year of the arrests. And I showed up at the yard sale, and my main question was kind of like, who directed you to make these payments? Like, blink twice if it's Phil Bryant, right? And she obviously wouldn't say anything. But fast forward about a year later, I finally developed this relationship that kind of broke everything wide open, because this source had access to the text messages that investigators had retrieved in part of their investigation. And these text messages were between Phil Bryant and Brett Favre, where Brett Favre was enticing the governor with stock in the company in exchange for his help. And the governor was promising to, in sports metaphors, open a hole for Brett Favre. Shortly after that is when the company started receiving these stolen welfare funds. As far as surprises go, I think that I'm really surprised by this sort of like cultish energy at the Department of Human Services, that there were all these state employees kind of watching this money just fly out of the door. And there didn't seem to be anyone willing to speak up against what the agency was doing. We're either too fearful, or we're just sort of committed to the status quo, as state leaders are, so apt to. So we published our series in April of 2022. And after that, I think that we found that our reporting really emboldened defendants in the case to speak up against the governor's involvement. Up to that point, they hadn't really. And when our story is published, which, was such an extraordinary thing for readers in Mississippi to actually see communication and, in the politicians' own words of how they were thinking about doling out these welfare funds, it was kind of like, we can't hide it anymore, like the cat's out of the bag. So we might as well go in and tell the truth about what happened. And we saw court filings that, made their own allegations against the governor, but also used our reporting to ask the court to look at Phil Bryant's involvement, and to basically say that, this case cannot go forward without also including the governor as a defendant. We've had our congressman and the NAACP reach out to the attorney general to ask for a DOJ investigation into the governor. And we, from the prosecutors so far, we're getting hints that they are looking at him. all of the defendants have now pled guilty and have agreed to cooperate with the prosecution, which we can only assume means that they are cooperating by giving information about how they were directed by the former governor. And there has been legislation introduced to reform this program.
Wow. Each of these, just if you think about it, you have a welfare department, schools, prisons, police department, utilities, such an interesting cross-section of agencies and government functions that, again, where the need for accountability is so great. I invite anyone watching who wants to put a question in the Q&A in the time we have left. I'll put one, well, actually, let me invite any of you to who wants to ask one of your co-finalists a question or follow up on something.
I had a question for Anna. It was a great project that you did, but I was just curious if you had any interaction directly with Mr. Favre himself and how that went.
So in the very beginning, when we realized that Favre could be involved, I had called him a few times and he did not call me back, but which is like kind of ironic with the whole story being about text messages. We did have a text exchange where I had sort of asked him, like, how do you know John Davis, the welfare director? Like, what were these conversations? And did you ever have conversations about the volleyball stadium with the governor, for instance? And he said no, which we would later find out was not true. And I one text that has sort of took on a life of its own is when I was asking him, like, why the state would have anything to do with this pharmaceutical company that he was backing. He said, "This is economic development, Anna, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point." So you could see that that was sort of his justification for getting money from the state, was that this was a company that was going to create jobs. And that is just right in line with the state's philosophy about, people living in poverty and how, state resources should be spent.
Many of you talked about the public records requests and the FOIA requests. How did you go about, I won't say crowdsourcing, but enlisting normal people who might have information to come to you and to find you, the ones who you couldn't track down? How did that work? It's for any of you.
I can take that, at least from our side. So the Federal Bureau of Prisons is notoriously bad in responding to FOIA requests. And we made it a point in some of our coverage to point out just how ridiculous some of the FOIA responses were. In the story that we wrote about Ray Hinkle, we knew that there was a photograph of him on the Bureau of Prisons internal website that someone had taken a picture of and given to us. And the Bureau of Prisons denied that photograph existed. They wouldn't provide anything. And they tried to cite personal privacy exemptions for a ton of other, in that and a ton of other FOIA cases. And so we just turned both to folks who worked inside the Bureau of Prisons and folks who kind of worked on the outskirts, whether that were, that was advocates and lawyers. And we took a somewhat unique approach, at least for the AP, in that we ran a separate story that laid out our findings and gave links to everything that we had uncovered so far. And at the bottom of that story was a specific invitation for people to send us letters. And since then, we've gotten hundreds of them. Letters from incarcerated individuals, from advocates and lawyers, and they've exposed other kind of systemic problems. We've been able to kind of pin together a network of different issues by looking at all of these different problems that people were telling us about in different places across the country. So I think, it worked well for us to just be very open with people that we want them to come forward and we want their tips.
Barbara, I was wondering on this front with you of whether some of the police officers who were still serving sort of felt like suckers, that there they are on the job every day when all of their, not all, but so many of their fellow officers were doing other jobs or not paying taxes. How much was this was there an internal sourcing opportunity just because of sort of resentment of gaming the system.
Yeah, it was huge because a lot of the cops who helped us, and there were a growing number who would help us, and it was because they couldn't get vacation time off because of the shortage. They couldn't go to like their child's recital or a birthday party. And also they were, I don't know if scared is the right word. I don't know the cops use that word, but when they're out and they want backup and they need backup, especially in Philadelphia, where the gun violence is so crazy right now, and they felt alone out there, and they resented people, especially when they looked at other cops' social media on Facebook, and they would see them at the beach, like there were pictures of these cops who were supposedly injured, and they were on the beach, they were on vacation, like in Puerto Rico, and it got them, pissed off, and so they wanted to help us. They felt like, I mean, a lot of these police corruption stories, as you guys know, we can't do it without good cops. You just can't. You need to be inside. And in any organization, I think you often rely on people who are hardworking, honest, and they're doing everything right. And they don't like that other people are doing things wrong and scamming the system.
Right. Well, we are at an hour, and I know there's more that people would love to learn. So let me invite everyone to join us live with our finalists when we will announce not just our winner, but have an interviewing note from this year's Goldsmith Career Award winner, Judy Woodruff, and award our Goldsmith Book Prize. Next Wednesday, Liz and Caroline Lindsay, correct me if I'm wrong, in Sanders Theater here in Cambridge on the Harvard campus, starting at 6 o'clock. We would love to see you. But regardless of sort of our winner, let me emphasize again that the work that you all do is such a model of the kind of journalism that the public depends on to both, shine a light into dark corners, to lift up things that are working, and to hold accountable things that aren't. And the kind of real dedication and determination that it takes to do this kind of reporting, I think, is apparent to anyone who has listened to you today. So I appreciate your time. I look forward to getting to see you all in person next week. And in the meantime, thank you so much for all the work that you have been doing. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.